I have been doing simulations for 30 years. So I'm a carpenter with a hammer in my hand and everything looks like a simulation. Sometimes I get a little carried away. So I'm going to ask you to give me the universal sign for carry on. You familiar with this? No? No. It's the dead horse. Okay, good. Now practice with, all right, so we have some people in the back. Horse, feet in the air. Okay. This is a test to see if you're actually ready to take a simulation, if you can actually do this, right? Okay. So let me ask you a quick question. Fill in the blank for me. Blank is the best teacher, and it's not a person. Experience, life, right? Experience is the best teacher. Life is essentially experience. We know that, right? But when it comes to learning new skills or teaching behaviors, what do we tend to do? We teach. We instruct. We design content so that our students at any level will learn it, right? And that's important for stuff that we don't know. But when it comes to the tough stuff that is contextual in nature, that requires actually some thought in terms of decision making, what do we need to get better at it? We need experience. Now, I would suggest to you that if it's so obvious, right? We all know that experience is the best teacher. Pretty much everybody fills in the blank the same way. Then why is it that we're not doing more? So actually, rewind. I'm going to ask you, if you don't believe me, suspend your disbelief for a moment. Simulation approximates experience. That's the goal. And I'll explain a little bit more about what simulation is. But the goal here is to actually provide opportunities for experience. If, in fact, we know that experience is the best teacher, and maybe simulation approximates that, why isn't everybody simulating?
Cost, time.
Okay? Lots of reasons why. But I would actually suggest to you that one of the key reasons that actually makes these issues even more important or more painful in the doing of it is the fact that instruction and learning have essentially become synonymous. So we tend to look at everything through a teaching lens. Even when we do quote-unquote experiential learning, right? Typically we're focused on the right way to do it, on best practices, mastery. Right? That's what those exercises are focused on. Now that makes sense when we're teaching, right? Because we have content, this is what you need to know, so I'm going to convey it. But how do we learn best from experience? From failing, right? From the error part, right? When you touch the stove and it's hot, you learn, oh, I better check that. So when you think about that, when we design for instruction, we're governed by the right way of things. And yet when it comes to experience, we're going to be governed by the wrong way to do things. Those don't necessarily match. And therefore, what you need to do is a separate, doesn't replace the need for instruction, but when you're going to design for experience, we need to design with failure in mind. And that requires something a little bit different. And so what I want to, reason why I'm telling you this before you actually get into the exercise, is that the exercise is built around the premise that this is going to be an experience. It's going to be an opportunity for you not to do it right. You can. I mean, there are options that, there'll be decision options that you're going to make. Think of it as a choose your own adventure exercise, which I'll get to in a moment. There are going to be better answers and worse answers in that context. But it's not about getting it right. It's about having an experience so we can actually leverage the concept that experience is the best teacher. So I have been, as I mentioned, doing simulations for a long time, more on the corporate side. So I've worked with leaders from around the world in multiple industries, at all levels, or many levels. And I would suggest to you that having now started working in K-12 for the last number of years, that the job of the administrator in a school or in a district is probably the most pathetic job I've come across. And I mean that with great respect. Because nowhere have I seen a job where the stakes are so high, the decisions themselves are complicated, but you've got a group of stakeholders whose demands are so exclusive of each other and that each one is more irrational than the next. So really, no matter what you do in terms of your decision making, no matter how good your decisions might be, you're still going to get whacked. The question is whether you have the ability to get back up and continue doing the job. So what I would suggest to you that two of the key skills required in administration is, on the one hand, the ability to exercise good judgment. Right? You have to make good decisions, or the best decisions you can. But at the same time, you have to be resilient. You have to be able to get up off the ground when you get knocked down, even when you know you did it right, but still be able to carry on. And the thing about judgment and resilience is that you can't teach them. I can't teach you to exercise judgment. I can tell you about judgment, but you only get better at these two through experience. You only get better by doing. And not just enjoy these couple of quotes. Knowledge is being aware of what you can do. Wisdom comes from experience, is knowing when not to do it. And good judgment is a result of experience, but good experience is often the result of bad judgment. So when we talk about this idea of developing, especially when we're looking at a new set of skills from a leadership perspective, the best way to build that is going to be through experience. The question is, how do we do that in a less painful way? Because the school of hard knocks sucks. Excuse me. So that's what simulation is all about. So really just to give you an insight, so when you hear the word simulation, it may bring a whole bunch of different things in your head, but I want to define it for you. To create an experience that is something that you can actually get some potential benefit from, the one thing I found so fascinating about schools is the role of context. So the first thing we want to do is capture a realistic, if you're going to have an experience, it should be something that you can relate to, right? It's got to be relatable. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be recognizable. It's not going to be your school, but it could be. The role of context is really, really important to create an environment in which you feel like, okay, this looks like my school. This looks like my building. This looks like the people that I interact with. So that's important. But it goes beyond that, right? If we're not situationally aware in decision-making from a judgment perspective, that's one of the things that helps us get it wrong. And you have things like the demographics of your student body, the relationship amongst the staff, the relationship that you have with staff, the relationship in the district, the relationship with the community, the relationship with the parents. All of these things influence the way you make decisions, right? Not only that, but even the time of year. Right? You'll make, in the same situation, you may make a different decision if it's the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, the end of the year. So being situationally aware is critical. So we want to create a context. So the simulation will do that. Then we want to give you an opportunity to exercise judgment, to have to actually make decisions. You'll have to make choices. You'll have to exercise critical thinking. You'll make decisions. But then it's important that you have the opportunity to experience consequences. If you make a bad decision, you should get whacked. But the beauty of the simulation is nobody's going to reach out from, we've thought about the idea of incorporating electric shocks through the keyboard. We haven't gotten there yet. So rest assured, it won't happen. But it's important to experience the consequences, not just right away, right? Immediate consequences are important, but what happens over time is also important. Sometimes the one and dones give you some insight into the right decision in the moment, but takes away the opportunity to see, well, you may make a good decision for that moment in that room, but what about what happens next week as a result of what you did here? Maybe you made a great decision here, but maybe there would have been a better decision for the system that wouldn't have a later consequence either with somebody else in your stakeholder group or whatever the case may be. So time is a factor. Then we want to give you the opportunity for feedback, for reflection, and lastly, doing it in a group. It's wonderful to have an experience yourself, and we can learn from experience, but this is designed to actually allow you to benefit not just from the experience that you have, but from the experience of others. When you get to a decision, invariably amongst the group, you will have differences of opinion. You'll have to make one decision, but you've got to come to consensus of some sort. So the opportunity to discuss it, the opportunity to share perspective, the opportunity to, in the context of the sim at least, share those perspectives is potentially a very powerful item. So just real quickly, in terms of, again, distinguishing between some of the challenges that you face from a decision-making perspective and why this approach is potentially very, very important. This was a study I came across called the Millennium Project, 15 Global Challenges Facing Humanity. Pretty heady stuff. And when you start looking around the globe, you see the things you'd expect to see. What I found fascinating was number 9 on the bottom, the capacity to decide. They determined in this study that our ability to make decisions is a global challenge facing humanity. Not the people in this room, by the way. So in case you were thinking I was directing it at you. Now, when you think about it, especially in schools, that actually does kind of make sense, right? On the one hand, we've got access to so much data. We have no idea which are the important data. What do we do with that data once we determine that? So we get analysis paralysis on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're half a step away from being a headline. So the fear of failure is at play. Thinking about that spectrum and where you lie on that is pretty scary stuff. So getting practice with making decisions in and of itself can be important, just to make the decision, make the call, and move forward. Now, this is a deep slide. I'll give you a moment to process. Come on, it deserves a little bit more than that. As human beings, we are mindless, habit-forming creatures. Critical thinking is not a natural skill. So we need to practice at the critical thinking. Doing a simulation isn't going to get you to do it right. That's not the point, because it's contextual. In a different situation, it'll go differently. However, what we do want to program in there is the pause, that opportunity to think first. Don't go with your gut necessarily. Confirm it first. Validate it. Just give that little second to say, maybe something is a little different here. Just give it an extra second of thought. So the opportunity to practice that is very important. And ultimately, the focus of simulation is not on a particular competency or standard, which instruction is, by definition, right? We're going to teach you the information you need to know, which is based on something. But every simulation is going to focus on, no matter what the problem of practice that we've captured, is focused on making better decisions, solving problems, and doing it collaboratively. Because those are three key things which are leverageable everywhere. And we do it through encouraging critical systems and creative thinking. And the idea of systems thinking, if you're not familiar with that, is just thinking about the system. Thinking not just about, maybe you're focusing on the needs of a student. Now, but you're doing that in the context of a system. You can try and maximize the student, but sub-optimize the system, right? You can make a great decision for a student, and the rest of the students in the class may not be happy about that. The building may not be, the administration might not be happy about it. The parents might not be happy about it, whatever the case may be. So just having some insight into what may come. It may not change the decision you make, but maybe it'll better prepare you for that blowback that's bound to come, the resilience piece. And lastly, this idea of, when I came across this, I was tickled. This is, and by the way, the slides, Brian or Paula will share the slides with you, so you'll get them. This is one of the frameworks that have been identified as 21st century learning, lifelong learning skills. There's variations of this graphic from different, this is the World Economic Forum's version. What I found fascinating about this is, so they break it up in terms of three sets of skills. The first are the foundational literacies, which if you look at them, literacy, numeracy, scientific literacy, the stuff you'd expect to see there, that's the stuff we can teach, right? That's the stuff we do teach. But when you look at the competencies, which is the middle, that's the 4 C's, and you look at the character qualities on the blue ones, which include curiosity, initiative, grit, adaptability, you can't teach any of those. I can tell you about them, but we're only going to get our students better at them through experience. It's a fascinating thing. So the benefits of this modality is you're going to play a simulation, a version of simulation as I've defined it. But the idea of capturing and deploying experience in terms of your other activities with other students, it's a very powerful model that allows for the development of these other skills in the context of the foundational literacies that have to be built as well. So as you experience this, we'll debrief it a little bit at the end, and certainly would be open to further discussion downstream if anybody's interested. But the opportunity to expand in terms of adding this approach, a different complementary approach to focus on experience in your other work, may actually be something worth taking a look at. All right, so what we're going to play today, so hopefully you got the link from Paula. Now, hopefully when you load it, this is what you will see. So I want to give you so before you load it, let me just walk you through this real quickly. So in terms of the exercise, what you're going to be doing is taking over the life of a principal in a school, and you're going to be dealing with the problem of practice around a disruptive teacher. Okay, you're going to be introduced to the characters, and you're going to have to make decisions. And again, every decision, when you get to a decision choice, every option has a path, right? This is a choose-your-own-adventure exercise, so when you get to it, just bear in mind that when you make a decision, you're going to have to deal with it. And it's not going to tell you whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. You're going to experience whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. Now, what you will find is that if you are you're facing the situation and you're thinking, boy, I know what I would do, and you don't see that as a choice. Why do you think that is?
Because you have based on a belief system, or?
Well, chances are because the choice you'd want to make is the more obvious choice. And if the goal, the underlying goal is critical thinking, if we included obvious choices, what happens? No critical thinking. And the fact is that in real life, oftentimes, we can't do the obvious choice, right? Due to constraints in the circumstances. And we have to go with an option B or an option C. And the question is whether we've thought about that. And what might be the potential benefits of doing that or not doing that, et cetera. So as you go through it, please reflect upon those choices, and nobody's going to measure how you do. The thing about having an experience and it being really potentially impactful is if we have the opportunity to reflect, right? If there's no reflection, then the experience might not be all that worthwhile, or we may not actually learn from it. So it's really important to have that opportunity for reflection. The sim gives some of that feedback, but here's where the opportunity also to talk a little bit about what you found compelling, what you agreed with, what you didn't agree with, what you were surprised by. Any thoughts?
The scenario was extremely challenging because the powder keg was already set, and it's going to be very difficult with these many feelings, this much disruption already having happened in the past, to very easily get it going again.
So what did you take from that?
Don't wait. Clearly, if there's that much hostility, and it's a pretty extreme example, if there's that much hostility, something should have been done probably like 3 years ago. Don't wait until it's about to explode. Intervene early.
So one of the things that's great, thank you. One of the things that's important to think about sim and the idea of experience is it's going to be most powerful in the blend, right? So when we think about blended learning, this is not necessarily done in isolation, right? When you use a sim, you might use it in concert with maybe something that's going on in the building, right? This may be a climate issue that we're talking about how we can be better as a team. So it'll be framed in that way. Or it may be part of an instructional component where you're talking about having difficult conversations or things about that. Now here's an opportunity to apply that. But these are the kinds of observations you want to be making, to be thinking about, okay, so what's our role? Did we not see any of this, right? We did hear that in the beginning, that she's particularly unpleasant, so we know Diana's a problem, right? And one of the participants yesterday mentioned that in her building, they have a similar situation, and they're presently figuring out what the outcome is, that they're negotiating the movement of Diana. So because of the union, because of the contracts, that's just the way it is. But the question is obviously contending with it, and the thing about the time factor, right, which is often missing in case studies, is that you have to deal with it, the time factor, right? So you're starting in a context, so you're taking over a bad situation, but you have to make the best of it, if you can. Thank you. What else?
I think the power in this lies in the fact of that's not what I would do with those choices. So it forces you to analyze, to use your critical thinking skills, because you don't know all the information. It's kind of like solving a math problem, but you're missing a key piece to it. So it forces you to think about it in a different way, or how I would handle it in that sense.
Which is a little closer to real life, right? Because you often can't control when a situation crops up. You have to deal with it. You don't have the time to study, to necessarily. I mean, unless you do. Okay, great. Thank you. Anybody else?
and there seemed to be a lot of mixed messaging in the simulation that we noticed. We like ran what, 4 times? And it's like, you know, it almost seemed like a no-win situation because it's like, I want you to do something, but I don't want to be involved at all and not help out and don't bring me into it, but fix it.
So that you're saying that that was Diana thinking that, or the principal?
So I thought Diana was the mean person. It was Kim.
Yeah.
Kim was the one
I'm
asking
sorry,
for
Kim.
something, but then was totally like trying to like.
Don't put me in.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then like when we're asking for support, like, well, this is an issue, and then she's like, well, I you know. And so it's like, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to take care of it, or do you just want to wallow in your situation?
Now, is that all totally unrealistic? Would that never happen?
It happens all the time.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of teachers. Yeah.
Well, so how many, but just
We have
one second.
conflict.
How many of you actually didn't lose Kim? Sorry, not Diana. Did not lose Kim. So only one group. Okay, so there is a path that it's not a no-win situation. So there is a path that you end up working with the district to move Diana. But so if you, by the way, and you will have access to the sim to go back to if you're interested for a couple of weeks, plus another sim which you'll get from Paula if you want to play another one. So just FYI. Go ahead.
I'll share. I was in the exact same situation, and I've had really good collaborative experiences, you know, in many other years. This is like a bump in the road.
I'm sorry, you were the bully or the being bullied?
I was being
I'm
bullied.
just kidding.
I would never do that to a teacher ever. Because I've had some really good collaborative experiences, and when they're really good, they're really good. This one it was basically looking down the road. So then the next year, I'm not there, and another teacher she was bullying was not there. I think it was guys she didn't seem to particularly care for. And so it was nasty letters, it was, you name it, it was everything. And we just kind of pushed it off. The admin was like, didn't really want to intervene. And so what wound up happening was I wound up switching departments, the other teacher wound up leaving, and then the next year I left. And then what wound up happening was several years went by, lost a lot more teachers, good teachers, and then eventually a new principal came over and that teacher left. And it's a much better situation now, the few teachers that I know that are still there. You're just going to lose a lot of teachers if you don't intervene and hit it right away, period. And I just was like, I'm done. I can't teach in this situation. There's no way out. The principal is the only line that
And when you met with the principal, I mean, how close was this to the interactions that you had with
as
the
close as it gets. I mean, this is near perfect. Exactly what we went through. Like when they weren't hitting it on we were trying to address it, and it just kept kicking it. We left the meeting going, okay, what really happened? What was really done about this? Nothing. And next time around, something that she didn't like, and she was bullying again. And it's crazy. We laugh about it now. I still talk to the other teacher. We laugh about it now, but it's like.
And is that teacher teaching somewhere else? Do you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Oh, yeah. But yeah. Yeah, she is.
And was that a union issue or just a building issue?
Building issue. No, we didn't even get union involved or anything like that.
You know, one of the things, thank you for sharing. First of all, just so you know, all the sims are that I was never myself a principal or an administrator in a school. What I do is sim, but I collaborate then with those who were. So this was somebody's story who obviously had an experience very similar to yours, which I'm not interested in recreating history. It's just creating that context. So this was her experience, so whether or not you agree with it or disagree with it, it's kind of the point, right? The beauty of this modality is that if you see something that you say, either your choice that you'd want to do isn't there, or the consequence that happens when you made a choice that you thought was perfectly reasonable, and it goes badly, and you're going, nah, that wouldn't have happened that way. If you're engaged in the exercise and you can actually explain why you think that way, I've actually accomplished my objective. Because the goal is critical thinking. The goal is not to give you the experience you wanted to have, or the experience you expected to have, or doing it right. It's just to have an experience. And if it forces you to think, then like you said, the opportunity to consider that I now see options. I now see that it's not about doing it one particular way. And the fascinating thing that I love about this modality is, you mentioned in the back there, right, that you were tense, right? So you felt tension from the simulation, right? So the research on the brain that talks about this idea of how do we make things sticky, how do we move things from short-term to long-term memory. If you're interested in a good read, there's a book called Brain Rules by John Medina. It's not about learning in particular, but it is about how the brain is wired, and spends a lot of time talking about this idea. It can take a long time to move things from short-term to long-term memory. One of the key enablers of that is emotional engagement. When we are emotionally engaged in what we're doing, we tend to remember it, right? You can, as evidenced by, you can probably remember vacations you took as a kid, and yet you probably are not remembering what you had for lunch yesterday, unless it was a particularly exciting lunch. So this modality, because of how we relate to stories, because it ties into something that we've experienced, if there's tension in the exercise, we'll feel tense, which has the potential of making it more memorable. If we laugh, right, humor, if we're, whatever it is, stressed, these are all things that can help the learning process because it taps into the way we're processing it in our brains. The beauty of this modality is that it's built on the power of stories. And I would suggest to you that when it comes to engagement, which is probably the most important thing, I think, in learning, because if you've got engagement, anything is possible. If they're not engaged, or if you're not engaged, nothing can happen. There's probably no more powerful tool than stories from an engagement perspective, because there's no age and there's no culture around the world that doesn't at its core have a love of stories. So the opportunity to harness that energy, to harness that potential, and in fact, I've come across research, again, another book if you're interested in, it's called research by Paul Zak, Z-A-K, called The Moral Molecule. He actually wanted to understand how stories affected the brain. And what he determined is that it's oxytocin. And he did this through blood draws. This was in a lab. I mean, this was a serious research project. Determined that when we engage in a story, oxytocin is released in the brain, and we feel more generous and trusting. So that's why commercials, when we see kids, God forbid, with cancer or some horrible thing, that we feel compelled to write a check, we feel generous in that moment. The mechanism is it's chemical. We can't help it. The moral molecule, which is oxytocin. And it's fascinating to me. That means if the Sims can be engaging and hook you from the story perspective, then as you're sitting around the table, not only are we engaged by the story, but the fascinating thing about humans is that we love to process our own experiences by what? By telling stories. This is how we're wired. And so this provokes the sharing of stories. So not only are you having an experience of your own, but you have the opportunity to benefit from the past experiences of others, positive and negative, because it provokes that opportunity for sharing and that discussion of options. Oh, I don't like any of these options. I would do what? I had this in my building when? And all of a sudden, that peer-to-peer opportunity can be pretty dramatic. So thank you again for sharing. Anything else? Thoughts, questions, observations? Yeah.
Just one last one, and it may go against forcing people into making decisions, but one of the things that was hard for me was I didn't know the relationship between the principal and Kim. So it was hard to tell if maybe she was somebody who you thought, well, if she's saying this, it's probably true, as opposed to she kind of can be dramatic, you know. And so if you don't know the relationship of how you feel about her as a member of the staff, that makes it harder to know how far to press that.
So if we were talking about that, if we were in a larger session, I would actually question you on that, and that's what we're interested in, because now what you're identifying is contextual issues that are important in a decision-making process. It's missing in the sim, right? So it's forcing you to fill that in. Now you can fill it in with nothing and just go with what's there, or you can think about what are those important elements that I would need to know. So in other circumstances, how important is the relationship how conscious should I be of the relationship that I have with my colleagues or with my administrator? Right? So the opportunity, it's designed to be a little frustrating from that standpoint. Right? We can't encompass everything, but can we do it, and we don't want it to get destructive, right? So as long as it's constructive when you're having to think about it, the opportunity to fill in those blanks with assumptions that you're making, which if you do, by the way, and somebody in your group says, no, I would never have thought that, right? Then you get that opportunity to discuss that. But absolutely, those are things that are not going to be there, but that you have to think through to see about filling in those gaps.
I had a comment to your reaction about what she just being dramatic. I don't know, I just had this knee-jerk reaction, because it's a reaction that a man sometimes would have about a woman, but it shouldn't devalue, even if she was dramatic, it shouldn't devalue her experience or the validity of what she experienced. So that can be something that, another lens that we have to be aware of, because females can sometimes be dramatic, but it doesn't lessen the validity of the concerns.
That's a great point, and it's fascinating. It happens to be that in this simulation, we actually have two versions of this simulation. We actually took the same script and reshot the video with all men. So let me ask you this question. So to that point, if it was a man that came to you as the administrator and acted in a similar way, conveyed that distress of being bullied by another teacher, do you think, since you're not seeing it, do you think you would have had the same reaction?
I was when we went through the simulation at first, I was like, who's who? Because I couldn't remember. And I'm like, oh, well, that one, like, her makeup made her look like the mean person. So I was like, oh, she must be the mean person. And so maybe if it was a male, because that's typically not, I guess socially accepted that they would wear makeup, so I would have that look of like, oh, that's the mean person. Could change perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating thing, and this is another opportunity within this modality, is to surface unconscious bias, is to be able to look at this thing and say, because you're in the moment, right? You're reacting to her. So because when I played them, since I have both of them, I had a very different reaction to Kim than I did, I forget the man's name, to him. So I recognize I have a bias. Now, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's an is thing, right? As human beings, we are biased creatures. We can't help it. We're biased about all kinds of things. Some of them don't matter, and some of them do. So the question is not, can we actually eliminate bias? I live in Philadelphia, so if you heard about that Starbucks issue that happened earlier in the year, and I read, this was actually in a New York Times article that said that Starbucks announced that they're going to doing their diversity training, and they're going to, with the effort to eliminate unconscious bias. Right? That's really, I mean, that's in print. I mean, somebody actually wants that associated with their names, that they actually said that. It's not, bias isn't his thing, but that doesn't mean we have to be governed by it. If we have a bias, if we can reflect upon the fact that it is, but we can still make good decisions, then that's a much more powerful opportunity. And again, the role of oxytocin means that if in fact, for me, I'm looking for confirming evidence, so I found it, I'm going to hold on tight. If in fact oxytocin is flowing, that means we have the opportunity to actually have a conversation, even though it's a potentially confrontational issue, even though it's something that may, at its core, have the opportunity for significant disagreement. But maybe we can approach it in this constructive way that says, okay, so we're not criticizing, it is what it is. But how do we make better decisions given that? And so the opportunity to look at these kinds of things and, yeah, recognize that we're in that moment. Maybe, again, from a context perspective, there may be a gender bias. There may be how they're dressed. It may be all makeup, maybe all kinds of things, right, in terms of how we observe things. But the ability to recognize that and be able to reflect upon it presents an opportunity for further development. Thank you for that. Anything else? So one of the things we offered yesterday is, as I mentioned, all the sims actually come from buildings. So if you have particular stories that you think would manifest interestingly in this kind of modality, by all means, let me know.
Are all your sims from the perspective of an administrator, or do you have some for like teacher leaders? So
at present, they're all administrator. Teacher leaders manifest in the sims, as in this one, but they're currently administrator. Again, as in my carpenter status, I think the application goes, I'd love to do teachers, I'd love to do parents, I'd love to do boards, and that's just in schools. But the opportunity to create these kinds of exercises is something that, again, the beauty of this approach is that, for me, is that A, there's not going to be a day where we'll have no more stories, right? Nor are we going to wake up one morning and say, you know that critical thinking thing? We got it. We're good. So it's just a matter of capturing the stories. And if you have something that was compelling to you, there's a really, really, really good chance that it's compelling elsewhere. I mean, I've not heard somebody actually say they had the same experience. Not to say that there wouldn't be, but it's great to hear that it was. That it manifested in that way, because many people say, well, no, I wouldn't have, they have disagreements, right? They would have thought it would have gone differently, or they would have thought that the interplay would have been, but it's not. So the opportunity to see things through those lenses becomes very powerful.
We were though shocked the first time she was gone in minutes, and we were like, oh God. And we were like so shocked. We thought it was the best decision, so I imagine the critical thinking would be of an admin in that scenario would be like, you would be thinking back like, what did I do wrong? What did I not intervene soon enough? And then we were talking about the fact that there was there must have been some other currents, but she didn't tell us enough. So then we decided, okay, we're going to do this again, but we're going to be better. So that might be even a realistic thing, like, okay, next teacher will be better than next staff, or...
I mean, some of the things that I like, the ones I like to simulate in particular are issues that when you face it it shouldn't be the first time, right? So you shouldn't be learning on the job when there are kids at stake, or like we have one on navigating student suicide. Right? That's not something somebody's ever going to get good at, but the only way to get better at it is through experience, and God forbid anybody should have a lot of experience with it. So, or school security, or a transgender student, or things where there's some pretty high stakes, and it's not an easy thing, and it's a minefield, and really it's navigating and losing as few body parts as possible, if you'll excuse the metaphor. But so absolutely.
I think what was funny in our group was the first time we kind of took this as a, let's be cool about it, and it was like instantaneous. Here's your letter, I'm gone, bye. So then the second time was like, all right, well, let's just go hardcore, right? Let's just rule with an iron fist here, and all right, here's your letter, bye. And I'm like, so we had to realize very quickly that you can't be at one extreme or the other. You really got to come to the middle and walk that tight line there. And it's funny because when I was a supervisor for Harrah's before I became a teacher, it was the same thing, especially dealing with dealers in the pit, not other supervisors, but dealers, and their interactions with customers, because they can get, I'm sorry if you guys ever been to a casino, dealers can get kind of, oh, you're not tipping the dealers, so, okay. And you have to have those conversations, and if you go the wrong way, they get mad at you, and if you go But it was really simulation imitating life.
Well, that's the thing. It's also, what we simulate is the human piece, which is that even the same person won't react the same way from time to time. And so if you're not reflective, if you're not thoughtful, chances are it'll go badly.
Yeah, I'll say even been in the same situation. I mean, it's like 6-7 years ago since I was in that situation. I don't know, believe me, I'd love to forget it. But I made the wrong decision. I didn't say, hey, why don't they ask for more information? I said, which seemed to be the most caring, I guess, answer. And yeah, I mean, I would definitely, I like this because it refreshed the situation. Because I've avoided those situations since then because I know how to target it now. So I'm never in that situation now. So the refresher was really good for that.
That's great. Yes?
I'm just curious, have you ever done your simulation in a culture that's different than the culture of the United States? Because I come from another country, and if you show this to the teachers, they will have a different outlook on what's going on.
So I've done projects outside of the U.S. In schools, we did a project in Chile with Catholic University there, and those sims were different because we had to incorporate the cultural elements. But in my past in corporate, we did sims that actually did span the globe, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Because if you encourage a if you capture an element that's culturally acceptable or even encouraged, an easy one was in the concept of project management. A best practice is you push back against your boss, right? You have to push back because you own the project, even if you don't have responsibility beyond that. And if your boss is asking you to do something that is not going to support the project, you really should push back if you can, and then find a way to do it properly. So we actually ran the simulation in Germany. Now, German culture, and I don't mean to stereotype, but German culture has a stereotype of being more hierarchical. And it is strongly inappropriate to promote pushing back as a best practice. And so we had to change the sim. So you have to find that place. So the human part, the school part maybe, right? Sometimes in Chile we had to do independent schools because they don't have a public school system. So you have to figure out where the distinctions are and if it's destructive or constructive, right? If it's to say, this is the way they do it in America, and that's worth reflecting on just that it's somewhere different, not that it's America per se, but something other, okay, but here it would be different, but why? Is it just because that's the way we do it here? It's not just because it's the right thing to do? Then that's potentially beneficial. If, on the other hand, it's no, it could never happen that way, or we would never do that, and in fact, it's horrible to think about, then obviously we'd have to reflect. So we have to manage that line, but because of the human part, there's potential, and certainly the modality works everywhere around the world that we've tried it, but obviously you have to be careful the kinds of things that you're capturing and whether or not it is the opportunity for reflective thought or it becomes destructive. All right, so you'll get the slides. My contact information is in there if you have questions. But again, feel free to go back and play the sim. If you want to share it with others outside of the cohort, that's okay for the next couple of weeks. And you'll also get linked to another sim, which it's a shorter sim on dealing with a more mundane issue of a dress code issue with a teacher. But enjoy and good luck. Thank you.